Morning. Thanks to JJ for obviously inviting me to present, and thanks for your good selves for attending for this presentation. Generally, we're going to be looking at the building regulations, analysing some different case studies, and look at obviously some of the future for building control as a whole. Just so you're aware, our Building Control Solutions, they're an approved inspector set up in 2014 by my colleague Brian Gerhardt. Are we okay with the microphone, JJ? Sorry, I'm just checking. Are we okay with the microphone? Everyone can hear me, can't they? Yeah. That's fine. Set up in 2014 by my colleague Brian Gerhardt. We're based down in near Newbury, but we've also got regional offices. The closest to you good selves would be in Abingdon, near Oxford. My office is the Salisbury office, and we're based Salisbury, Winchester, and that area. But we also have offices in Cambridgeshire and Bristol. We can go up to London and cover that area as well. A little bit about me. I started off in architectural design, worked for the NHBC after that in building control, and have since had the privilege to work for both local authorities and approved inspectors. Let's just have a look at the presentation itself. So the idea generally is to give you an overview and an indication of what we do as building control surveyors. To do this, we're going to have a look at the building regulations and the approved documents, give you an indication of their definitions and similar. And through this process, it will give you a good insight to the differences between approved inspectors and local authorities, their different roles, their different methods. The main sort of focus of the presentation is to look at real life examples, both through the design review process and when we have plans submitted to us for review, but also through a number of photographic evidence, which hopefully will engage with a bit of discussion with your good selves. Just to sum up at the end, we're going to have a look at the role for building control in the future, particularly in light of the Grenfell disaster and its impact on the construction industry as a wider sort of concept. I know JJ mentioned, but if you do have any questions or queries as we're going through, it's supposed to be an interactive process and a discussion, so feel free to let me know. I do reserve the right, because obviously I don't have all of the documents and all the relevant information up here with me. If I don't know the answer off the top of my head, I will come back to you. If it's a query that you prefer to discuss in private, feel free to grab me after whilst we're having a coffee as well. Okay. So just to give you, like I said, a brief overview of where building control bodies sit and the legislation that they act under. The Building Act 1984 is the primary piece of legislation for which all subsequent legislation is sourced from. The Act itself, the relevant parts to the building regulations are Schedule 1 and Part 1, and what they enable is for the Secretary of State of DCLHC, Communities and Local Government, to create statute, to create building regulations. The current building regulations have been regulations, 2010 as amended. Just get this up in front of me. And the building regulations 2010 themselves are formed of 10 different parts and 6 different schedules. Now, to give you an indication of how the building regulations affect building control bodies, I'm just going to give you examples of how those parts affect our role. So, for example, Part 2 in sections 5 and 6 relate to materials change of use. Now, that's when a building is altered in its purpose to an additional one. So we're going to use examples of that in some of the case studies later on, but the example would be, for example, a barn conversion into a dwelling, or an agricultural building into an office, or a public building, or something similar. And that enacts certain elements of the Building Act, which means that certain elements of the building regulations can be applied. Part 3 details the plans and the notices that building control bodies are able to issue. So, for example, in a local authority, that would be the ability for architects, such as surveyors, such as yourselves, to submit plans under a full plan submission, or alternatively, a project to be submitted under a building notice, for example. You can also have, obviously, amendment notices and final certificates when the final project is completed. Another aspect which you'll all be aware of, I'm sure, is Part 5 in relation to self-certification schemes. So that's when we're talking about FENSA, window installers, Part P registered electricians, microgeneration schemes such as photovoltaic cells or similar. Looking at the schedules, an example of where the schedules are really impact upon our day-to-day lives. For example, Schedule 2 details about exempt buildings. So that's when we're talking about conservatories being exempt. If they're less than 30 metres squared and there's sufficient separation between the habitable space and that conservatory. That's when you're looking at exempt buildings for small detached buildings. So that's when, for example, garden sheds, carports or small garages as well. And the details of that are all within the Schedule 2. So for example, if a small outbuilding is less than 15 metres squared, then it is considered exempt. If it's between 15 metres squared and 30 metres squared, and more than 1 metre away from the boundary, then it's also considered exempt. Or if it's constructed of fire-resistant materials, then it's also considered exempt. So the key point of that is, from a building control body, we don't want to have to control your garden sheds, your small outbuildings, all those sorts of things. The only thing we're considering that in that aspect, if ever a fire occurs in one of those buildings, it's not the ability to spread to a neighbouring property is restricted. Running alongside the Building Regulations 2010 is the Building Approved Inspectors Regulations 2010. Now obviously the building regulations and the submission of the initial notices, the submission of the building notices and the full plans is relating to local authority building control, whereas an approved inspector regulations clearly relate to approved inspectors such as OWL or similar. The overarching theme of both those pieces of legislation is a control of the buildings and making sure that people in and around buildings are safe and welfare is maintained and the conservation of energy. That's the overarching theme of those things, and that's what you always need to bear in mind when you're looking at building regulations and building regulation applications. I've just made a note here regarding local acts just to highlight to you good selves that it's not just the building regulations that we as building control surveyors have to consider. So for example, the majority of local acts are now repealed and assimilated within the Building Regulations 2010. However, there are some little nuances that are dotted around the country, which we also need to be aware of, particularly in terms of fire safety. Talking about fire safety, another piece of legislation we would need to be aware of would be the Regulatory Reform Order 2005. Don't know if you good selves are familiar with that, but that's in relation to the need to consult with the Fire and Rescue Service in the event of a commercial development proposed or a residential development proposed which has a communal area. So if that's a flat with a communal area in the centre or something similar. So that just gives you a general overview of the building regulations themselves and the statute to which we work under. Any questions on that overview thus far? That's fine. Just in relation to the approved documents, there's a common misconception that the approved documents themselves are the building regulations. They're not. They are practical guidance for common solutions. And there is no legal obligation for designers, builders, etc. to comply to the approved documents. However, if you divert from the approved documents, the onus is on your good selves as designers or builders, etc. to provide additional guidance or reference which you have complied to. The perfect example would be approved document B, which volume 1, volume 2 deals with fire safety in and around buildings. The alternative that is used often for high-rise buildings, high-rise residential buildings, is British Standard 9999. BS 9999 provides an alternative that allows for further distances for means of escape and takes into account additional mitigation factors. So for example, things to be aware of with the building regulations are that building control bodies, when we complete a project, can only inspect at the point of the project in its process, and we would issue a final certificate at the completion of that project. BS 9999 allows the acceptance of mitigation factors throughout that building's lifespan. So, for example, if that building is going to be managed, if there's going to be a fire warden in place, if there's going to be management processes that will enable the fire risk to be reduced, therefore enables things like travel distances to be expanded and increased in comparison to approved document B. So I'm just using that as an example of where the approved documents aren't the golden rule and alternative methods can be used. Just in relation to the additional guidance as well, there's obviously a big focus at the moment in terms of testing of materials and standards. UCAS tested, UKAS rather than UCAS for universities, is what is required in terms of our acceptance. But we also generally, if you're looking at BBA certification or something similar as well. Other British standards that we look at as well, one of the key sort of divergences, I suppose, from instances on site and approved documents is approved document A, mostly because in the majority of projects, engineers will design out the majority of approved document A. But they also reference to British standards and Eurocodes, such as Eurocode 5, used to be known as the Trada tables, and that details the sizes of the timbers required in certain situations of roofs, joists, floors, etc. Any questions on those thus far? So, as we've talked about before with the different regulations, like the Building Act, building regulations, the approved inspectors regulations, the local authority and the approved inspectors have different overarching themes and different influences from different regulations. The local authority does building control work through, like we talked about, building notice and full plan submission, but it also has a number of unique functions which an approved inspector cannot complete, such as regularisations, which you may well have come across, particularly if you've got pre-acquisition surveys for something similar, where retrospective approval for works that have taken place previously but weren't inspected at the time can be applied for by the relevant homeowner. They also do things in relation to dangerous structures. Typically it's a boundary wall or something similar that's abutting a public highway, which is in risk of collapse, or high-level structures of TV aerials, roof coverings, etc., etc., etc. And the local authority under Section 77 and Section 78 of the Act are able to act upon those dangerous structures and remove that risk to the general public. Other things that they're required to complete by law is inspection of sports stadiums and the safety ground, the safety of those areas as well. The approved inspectors, of which OWL is one, are very different. We're regulated by the CIC, Construction Industry Council. Within the CIC there is the approved inspector register, so CIC AIR, and as I said, it's included under Building Regulations 2010, and a nice little spelling mistake which I missed off there. The CAC, they produce a number of documents and building performance standards for which we must comply to continue to remain as an approved inspector. One of the key points for building control performance standards is that as approved inspectors, we've got to minimise the disruption wherever possible for designers and builders and things like that on site. So we need relevant reasons to hold things up on site. And the last presentation when we were in Basingstoke, there was a number of questions regarding enforcement and those aspects. Approved inspectors, I just want to clarify, don't have any enforcement powers per se. In the event of a builder or an architect refusing to comply to a specific aspect of the building regulations, not the approved documents again, because we know the differences between those, the process you would go to would be a reversion to the local authority who would then enforce. So that our powers as an approved inspector are significantly reduced in regards to that aspect. Yes?
If the approved inspectors answer to the Construction Industry Council, who does the Construction Industry Council answer to?
Government, the communities, local MH,
DCLG?
Yes, exactly that. Right. Forgive too many acronyms that are coming up in my head. But yeah, exactly. Okay. The Secretary of State in that instance. There's also the Building Control Alliance. There's a number of bodies which I'm sure within your different professions you have as well. But there's also the Building Control Alliance who produce different guidance in relation to different aspects. They've really recently produced guidance, and we're going to look at Grenfell later on, but they've recently produced guidance in terms of combustible materials and ACM panels and something similar. But there's also lots of different contributing factors. Any other questions on that at all? Good. Okay, so now we're getting to the main sort of focus of the presentation. Like I said, what I've tried to do is provide real life examples, because I know there's a different sort of skill set and a different expertise within the room. So to try and provide real examples on what we do as a whole as building control bodies. So, and the other thing I would say, I've identified a couple of items, or 3 items or so, that I picked up on when plans were submitted. These aren't exhaustive. There would have been other items that were picked up or queried as well, and also the drawings that I've detailed aren't the whole package that was produced. Obviously, for example, in this scheme, it's a single-storey extension to the side and to the rear, and a little single-storey extension on that junction there. The removal of internal walls. So clearly, for this package, we would have had structural engineering details and similar, and we would have, and the calculations associated with those to justify those details provided. One of the queries last week was, would you be asking for pad foundations in those locations? So generally, what we would be doing is asking for junction details, the loads imposed, and when we had an assessment of the loads imposed, because we would be aware of the ground conditions, whether it's clay, chalk, or similar, we would be able to make an assessment of whether a new pad foundation was required when we started exposing the existing foundations on site as well. So that would be the process that it would work in terms of loads. So a couple of points that I've just picked up on, which hopefully will create a bit of discussion. So firstly, like I said, it's a single-storey extension, and initially the architect provided these drawings, but he didn't provide the first floor. So my query, and that's what we always try and do, is asking the question and get a bit more information from the architect or the builder. My query is in relation to the first floor and the bedrooms that are on that first floor, and what the means of escape strategy of the property was currently. So, for example, if the first floor is bedrooms are utilising egress windows to escape in the event of a fire, the installation of a roof lantern on that flat roof right next to where the kitchen is proposed could potentially cause an issue in terms of means of escape. So B1 of approved document B. So what I asked in the first instance was, well, the alternative would be, provide a protected hallway, which would be fire-rated doors on this surrounding here. But we need to be aware of what's there currently before we can make a judgment on whether that is an issue or not. The other item which I identified was the detailed boundary to the left-hand side. I know you can't see too much of it, but there's the boundary wall. And the issue was in relation to the unprotected area under B4 of the building regulations, the unprotected area of that door. Now, scaling off of the plans provided, it looked like the relevant boundary was only 900 millimetres from that left-hand side elevation. If you're less than 1 metre from a relevant boundary, then the maximum unprotected area that you're allowed under B4 is 1 metre squared. So in that instance, a door that would open would be exceeding that unprotected area. And I've included this one just purely on the basis that to provide a bit of discussion where there is room for sort of adaptation and interpretation of the approved document. So, for example, if that was a shower, which I'll go on to next, then it would need mechanical extraction. With a WC, it wouldn't normally require mechanical extraction to mitigate the risk of condensation under Part F. However, there is guidance within the approved document that says that if that window is going to need to be open to provide purge ventilation to prevent any condensation from occurring, if that is due to create a security risk, then the WC installed would require mechanical extraction, which means that obviously they don't need to open a window and some unscrupulous fellow is going to jump in and etc., etc. So it's down to interpretation. So for example, I suppose if that was on the front elevation and that was a street and there was no boundary in between and that WC was proposed there and condensation would build up and they'd need to open the window, then that would clearly be more of a security risk. At the back, if there was a secure gate in between, then you could argue. The other thing, of course, would be the size of the window, you know, those sorts of provisions. And what I've done is just detail some of the amendments that were made in the end, both from my queries, but also from the client's changes to the scheme, which inevitably always happens. So the first one to mention would be that the doors here were removed from the reception room to this entrance hallway. Due to the open plan nature of that room and the staircase itself, all of the first floor rooms automatically then become what's known as inner rooms, because we would need to travel through a room to get to our final point of escape in the event of a fire. So the presence of these doors removed at low level and ground level has then increased the potential impact of that roof lantern that's having, and the potential creation of a protected hallway through fire doors or similar has kind of been removed. As it was, the location of the first floor bedroom was remote enough from that roof lantern that meant that it doesn't have a significant impact on the means of escape. In terms of B4, what we were able to do is a further identification on site. It determined it was actually more than a metre away from that relevant left-hand side boundary. Now, when you're between 1 and 2 metres from a relevant boundary, you can actually go up to 5.6 metres squared, in which case this issue was effectively mitigated. And as I was talking about before about mechanical extraction, the installation of shower, a client changed her mind and decided she wanted a shower on the ground floor, in which case we need the extraction in there anyway. Does that make sense in just terms of an overview? So we'll just go on to the next. Yeah, of course.
The quality of information that you're getting, because one of the things you said on this one was it would have been useful to have a first floor plan.
Yes.
Which to me is a bit of a no-brainer, but the quality of it, because I'm a structural engineer, so we get these drawings.
Yep.
And they say, well, you know, what, can you do something with this?
Yes.
And the range of information we get is just incredible.
Yes.
From incredible detail
Yep.
to virtually a sketch on the back of a piece of A4 paper. So, are you finding that a problem?
I think the problem that the two problems that we have is, which I'm sure is replicated by your good selves, is not relevant information. So I'll have sometimes packages from architects which would be vast in terms of the scope that they're providing, and they're a similar spec to whether it would be a commercial development that was 1,500 metres squared or something similar to being provided for a single story extension, and you're trying to pick out the relevant information from that. Against, like you said, a lack of information, in which case you're just asking for more information. We try to be as cooperative and going back to those building control performance standards, as much as we can, we try and clarify over the phone and explaining why this is potentially an issue. So if in layman's terms, if somebody's doing a single story extension, then you could kind of understand why they don't need to have a first floor plan. But once you speak to the architect, generally you try and detail why that potentially would be an issue. But I see where you're coming from. One of our key issues, I suppose, is that the specification and its more general aspect rather than specific to the project, which when you're coming from a plan checking point of view is a lot more difficult because you have a whole range of information. Does that make sense? Sorry. Brilliant. I suppose, of course, coming from a structural engineering point of view, you just want the information specific to your loads, etc., rather than any more regarding sort of other aspects of installation.
Yeah, but you want more than that.
Yeah.
You want to understand the bigger picture.
Yes.
If you're thinking it through properly.
Yeah, of course. One of the key considerations, I suppose, for us in terms of structural engineers' details that we have is in terms of cold bridging as well, which is a key issue at the moment. So I think when engineers are only given an outline plan and an outline specification, if they provide a steel junction which is sitting with the external skin, and as building control body we need to tie the two together and say, well, this is going to be an issue because of the wall finish itself. I suppose if you were aware of that information, you wouldn't specify such a large steel, which means you wouldn't have that cold bridging issue. Yes.
I'm a structural engineer too.
Okay.
On the drawing there,
Yes.
I can't see the detail fully, but one of the things I meet a lot of times where it's been approved by building control,
Yeah.
and we go along and look at it and basically say it's not acceptable, is where they've taken out large openings on the back wall there.
Yeah.
So on that one, looking at it, they've got a pier on the right-hand side, which is relatively sort of, not at the far back, the one...
Oh, this one here, sorry, yes.
And then there's nothing else on that wall apart from a bit of new wall on the left-hand side.
Yeah, you're talking about the lack of restraint on that external wall, yeah.
Yeah, so stability-wise, to me, that looks iffy.
Yes, exactly. I mean, again, like I said, when we had the structural engineers package with this, the question I would have immediately raised was what, like you said, splint details and the junction of these piers. Now, whether there would need to be a goalpost arrangement or similar to provide lateral restraint if it was sufficiently tied into that external wall or similar, but it would be a question. Like I said, from a building control body, I think our role is to ask the question of structural engineers and/or architects. Now, immediately, you've raised a couple of relevant points that I would then be asking to the engineer to justify. Sorry, was it? Sorry.
Did you on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long time ago, to be honest. I must have, I would have done. I can't remember exactly what the solution was. I think generally what we have, and forgive me, I've had a couple of structural engineers arrangements now when we've had a ground bearing beam with a goalpost arrangement and a steel running across the top, which I'm not a massive fan of that detail per se, but that seems to be provided more often in terms of providing lateral restraint as well. Sorry, was there a question done? No, that's fine. So the next instance is just going to have a look at a loft conversion and the potential impact of Part K in the need to maintain 2 metre headroom up a staircase, but the impact on the insulation specified. So to achieve 0.18 on those sloping rafters, on sloping ceilings that we're going to create for the new loft conversion, normally a standard detail would be 100mm PIR in between and a 40 or 50mm PIR underdrawn to that to achieve the minimum U value. In this instance, once we got to the architect's details, it clearly an issue with headroom was identified. An alternative solution was proposed, going back to UCAS testing and BBA certification from a trio, so foil, whereby the 4x2 rafters that were there existing would have battens affixed to them with a PIR insulation in between and a multi-foil affixed with counter battens to allow ventilation to the back. And like I said, that's direct from the BBA certification that's provided with that material. So it's just to give an indication of how the different regulations can interact. So an issue in relating to headroom cause a potential issue in terms of condensation.
Is that not a bit prone to some thermal bridging there?
In terms of thermal, we've got a continuous layer of insulation in between the rafters itself, and then the trio, so foil, is compressed between the battens itself, so you have a continuous. The issue I often think about is in relation to condensation. So if you've got a void in between, effectively a dew point calculation that you can do, to ascertain whether when you've got insulation, air, then in another insulation, you've got a void in between. If that's not ventilated, then potentially you've got a point where condensation can occur. But as long as there's sufficient ventilation at ridge and at eaves, then the BBA certification is acceptable in this instance. Good. And just another instance again of B4, we had a large detached site, a new build, and to give you an indication of new builds and their requirements. So on this, there was a large amount of cladding and glazing at the front and back, similar to a sort of grand design approach, I suppose. But it wasn't considered the proximity of these relevant boundaries nearby. That one was less than a metre, and I think that one was about 3 metres away or similar. what I would say is, in terms of B4, there's provisions within the approved document that if that boundary was abutting a road or a canal or a train line or similar, you can take the centre line of that point, in which case, rather than being a metre away, you're going to be about 3 metres away, which obviously the extent of the unprotected boundary can be increased significantly. Things like car parks can also be considered as well, because again, remember, B4 is all about mitigating spread of flame to neighbouring properties. So if that abutting property isn't going to be built on in the not so distant future, it's not considered to be an issue. And then a consideration under B5, I talked before about the RRO, the Regulatory Reform Order, and under for a proposal of a new dwelling, we wouldn't be required to consult with the fire authority, but in this instance, if you had an access which was particularly narrow, then it would be due diligence for us to say to the fire authority how feasible it is it to gain access to this proposed dwelling. And I've just detailed a couple of points here for reference. I suppose in the need for PAS 24 door sets and windows to be installed for any new dwelling, and as well as the most recent regulation in terms of high-speed physical infrastructure, broadband or similar, to be installed for new dwellings as well. And just thought I'd mention it. I mentioned obviously previously that I work for the NHBC. There's a clear differential between warranty providers such as the NHBC and building control bodies. So, for example, building control body, if we were to have a partial fill insulation which has a relevant BBA certificate which allows a 10 mil residual cavity, which there are products out there that allow that, we would be able to accept that as a building control body because it meets the functional requirements of C2 or C1. A warranty provider such as the NHBC have their standards and require a 50 mil residual cavity come what may, in which case that's where the differences are. That's a simple instance. So I've just included this case study in terms of a commercial development. This was an old agricultural building upgraded to what was going to become I think it was a kitchen showroom or similar, and it's always an assessment of the existing thermal values. So that wall there actually had a cavity wall insulation injected into it, whereas the other external walls and the roof itself, the thermal values of those thermal elements were non-existent. And Table 5 in L2B provides threshold values, and if you can achieve those threshold values, then you don't need to upgrade the existing. So again, we talked about material changes use right at the start, and I think this is just good indication that all of the requirements of Schedule 1, A through to R, are applicable all of the time. So, for example, this was a barn conversion to a new dwelling, and under Section 5, Schedule 1 of the Act, the building is used as a dwelling where previously it was not. So that constitutes a material change of use. Now, down the left-hand side here, we've got all of the requirements, so B1, B2, B3, B4, B5, etc., all the way down to P. All the requirements of Schedule 1 that are applicable in the instance of a building's used as a dwelling where previously it was not. The clear one that is not noted, you see it says B4, I don't know if you can see that, sorry, but I'll just describe it. You can see it says B4 external fire spread roofs, which is Section 2 of that. There is no requirement in terms of the external fire spread for walls. So you could have, in the instance of barn conversion, a boundary right abutting that wall, which would be clad, which could have unprotected area in it, extensive windows or similar, and under building control you wouldn't be able to enforce for that to be removed or reduced in terms of its unprotected area. So it just gives you an indication not all of the requirements of the building regulations are applicable all of the time. Yes?
In Wales then, if we turn that into a dwelling, a barn, we'd have to fit sprinkler systems.
Yeah, I profess Wales and their regulations is not something I'm particularly familiar with because they are now completely different. But yes, you are correct that any new dwelling in Wales, I believe, it needs a sprinkler system, which I think came in a couple of years ago or so. There is rumblings that something similar will happen in England sooner rather than later, so we'll see. Just to give you another instance of where a material change of use and not all of the relevant requirements of Schedule 1 are applied. In this instance, I was actually asked to attend on an exploratory, similar to your surveying side, investigation of some instances of rising damp, and I just took a photo of that, where you've got a DPM terminating roughly and not linked into the external wall, and a void between the DPM and the DTC around about 300 millimetres or so. Clearly, one of the issues that was causing moisture ingress at that level, along with a number of others. What I had to explain, in this instance, it was a conversion of an agricultural building into an office, into a public building. In this instance, however, I had to advise the contractor and those on site that under building control, they wouldn't be able to enforce things like injected DPCs or similar. The reasons being that under 5E, like I said, building is used as a public building where previously it was not, so it does constitute a material change of use. However, it's only in the instance of Regulation 5A, which is a new dwelling, that resistance to moisture, C2, is applicable. So for the barn conversion, we'd have to say, yes, you need a DPC, yes, you need a DPM, yes, you need resistance to moisture. However, for the conversion to a public building, C2 would not be applicable. Again, just an example of where all the requirements aren't applicable. So what we've done here is just highlighted a number of photographic instances just to sort of engage with your good selves about some issues. Any ideas what the problems are on these two photos? Anyone? Yes. So it's timber frame construction. What we've got here, I know there's a presentation on timber frame later on, so that'll give you an indication. But what we've got here is got an external skin of a breather membrane, and these white socks, cavity socks, are providing a fire barrier between compartment lines. So that's one flap, that's another flap. And so what we have is an issue where the cavity sock is not continuous between the two. And also we've got penetrations of that timber frame which haven't been sufficiently, have a barrier all the way around them. Normally you'd have a fire sock wrapping around that conduit for the extractor fan. Good. A couple of other instances. So this is in relation to a loft conversion. The issue with this purely was, coming from structural engineers, the two of you here, was the design originally from the structural engineer for the trimmers of the new staircase that was getting installed. I don't know if you can see, but that's the external wall here, and the trimmers were proposed to abut onto that corner for the new staircase. The issue was that where the structural engineer, when it was all set out, rather than bearing upon that external wall here, the building itself was on a dog leg. So the external wall came back here and across there. So rather than the span of what was roughly sort of 3.2 metres or something similar, it actually was sitting on the external wall on the far side with a span of about 5.4, 5.5. So rather than doubling up or tripling up of the trimmer itself bolted together, the engineer had to come up with a splint detail which allowed that extended span. In relation to, again, we're good to a couple of structural engineers here. There was an issue in relation, I think that was a 254 by 102 beam, a universal beam, something similar. And abutting that with the new extension, the bricklayer had put two excessive bed joints with a slate joint running through the centre. I think they were roughly about 30 to 40 millimetres, those two bed joints. So clearly an issue on site, it doesn't look very good, and something, again, that from a building control body, I purely asked the question to the structural engineer whether it was going to cause issues. In this instance, we were able to provide a remedial measure which wasn't too onerous.
What was the remedy?
So the engineer effectively removed that junction of the bearing. But I think from an engineer and a building control body, we always want to improve the situation. So although it doesn't look very good, if it wasn't going to deflect or anything along those lines, I would have no enforcement action to ask it to be removed.
So it's very difficult to tell.
Sorry.
Is that brickwork directly on that block?
Yeah, exactly that. So yeah, you've got the two beams here bolted together, and then you've got these two bed joints around 30 30, 40 millimetres with a slate joint running through the centre. What we did, we removed that and we put in a high compressive strength block into that centre, which was could fit in and was pointed in afterwards. And they made a good job of it in the end and resolved the issue. But clearly we identified to the builder, I think as an ongoing training process, not training I suppose, but informing builders and similar, just trying to avoid that detail in the future. So yeah, these two photos just give you an instance. I'm not going to ask you to guess because it's quite difficult, but this was a fire-rated cupboard within a communal area of a block of flats. And what happened was the water main had to be moved, which clearly it was a timber frame stud, had obliterated that door reveal, which meant that the fire integrity of that communal service riser was removed. After they moved the water main, we did a repair and it was resolved sufficiently. You can note that the intermittent strips, which were going to be installed afterwards, which were required for any door off of any communal area for flats. In this instance, it's just an example of a fire damaged property. Obviously, luckily nobody was hurt or anything along those lines, but it was just an example again of the relevant requirements of the building regulation. So in this instance, because it was a fire damaged property, some of you might be loss adjusters or similar, in terms of their requirements, they were requiring it to be installed like to like. So from a building control point of view, when it was originally built, although we can ask for a thermal upgrade, again looking at those threshold values in terms of insulation thicknesses or similar, in terms of a control body, we can only really ask for a like-to-like replacement, so as long as it's installed as per the requirements.
Sorry, can I just clarify?
Yes.
So if you had to rebuild that wouldn't be current regulation?
Well, the point is, I think in this instance, it would be, so the new roof that was installed, that's a new element, in which case the new roof that was installed would have to be compliant to Part A. It was going to be a truss roof in that instance, as long as I've got manufacturer's bracing details and similar, justifying that would be sufficient. In terms of the floor, in terms of the walls, they were being retained and the insulation within the walls was acceptable. It was a partial fill, it was 40 millimetres in this instance, and it was acceptable, it hadn't been damaged, and the loss adjuster had confirmed that it could be retained. In that instance, I wouldn't, although it didn't meet the U values 0.28 of the current requirements, I wouldn't been able to enforce an additional insulation to be installed. And the same with the floor, for example, the floor slab, because that wasn't being altered in any way, it was just going to be retained. So in that instance, it's the new elements that we are controlling, the new roof, for example, the new staircase or similar. Does that?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of instances. Any ideas what the issue is with this one here? To give you an indicator, those are just the eye floor joist sitting on an internal stud wall. So generally, yeah, exactly that. So yeah, without blocking pieces in between those joists, it's likely to twist and rotate over time. And let you know, this is a timber frame property. I know you're going to look at timber frame later on. Any ideas of the issue in relation to the timber frame with this photo? Sorry?
That's not seen, was it? It's been made, it's a larger diameter piece that's been slit to make a smaller duct.
Yes, that's true in terms of the extraction duct, but also from a consideration which I'm sure will come clear later on with the timber frame presentation, there needs to be an allowance for differential movement. So you've got an external skin of brickwork which isn't going to compress, an internal skin of timber which will compress over time. So around those ducts, any penetrations through into the brickwork will need to have a compressible material around there. And there's quite detailed guidance in terms of the need for, as the stories increase, for more compressible material to be installed. This one I know we talked about before about loft conversions or similar, and the need for a void behind there. And clearly this is going to be a massive condensation risk because we've got insulation installed for the whole of the void of the rafter, touching the underside of the felt, in which instance the condensation of that felt is just going to transfer directly into the habitable space. And this instance was just a fire collar, clearly with a collar of that instance affixed to a ply face. In the event of a fire, it's just going to drop down and not contract. That's an intermittent collar, and that's an SVP or similar. In the event of a fire, effectively the plastic would melt, and the collar would intermess or expand and contract around that void, preventing any fire spread between compartment lines. A couple other instances. This was, again, in relation to the structural side, an instance of a truss roof combined with a cut roof. And some of the detailing wasn't ideal, which had led to the excessive bird's mouth at that junction, and some associated cracking running up the hip rafter. Went back to the truss manufacturer and they provided a splice detail which we could affix over there. This instance, again, going back to BBA certification and similar, they'd used a blown insulation within the loft space itself. Clearly issues in terms of maintaining the thickness as well, but also blocking any ventilation at the eaves for the roof void, potential condensation risk. And it didn't have any BBA certification for that location as well. The final one is, any ideas? This is a disabled toilet in a cafe environment. So any ideas what the issue would be with that? Looking at the grab rails.
Doesn't contrast visually.
Correct. Perfect. Yes. Fantastic. Yeah. So it's always difficult, I think, from a Part M point of view, from the other regulations, A all the way through to R, I suppose. From a building control body, you can because you know the concepts and the functions of the different issues you can sort of approach. But I think from Part M and disabled access, you really need to put yourself in the shoes of somebody with impaired vision or impaired access or similar. A couple of the structural issues again with the steel not bearing directly upon padstone, or in this instance engineering bricks. The way that I describe it is always taking an angle of repose. So a 45-degree angle off the bottom of those steels, and with those low density blocks, potential issue of cracking. I've done the structural engineers here, I'm sure. In this instance, this is a preformed trusses, the I-beams again, some lateral restraint straps, and all I did was I just popped a block on the internal skin, and you can see that lateral restraint strap has about 50 mil void between the two. So in the event of that being built up, it's going to have a 50 mil void. Not only is it going to push into the cavity with potential moisture ingress and similar coming across, but also that lateral restraint is ineffective. And the last one was just in regards, not great workmanship generally, but the wall ties being too far from that reveal. I think from memory it was around about 400 millimeters from that reveal. And clearly at a reveal, if it's not built in and tied with the external skin, that reveals an area where lateral movement can take place, which is why there's the need for wall ties within 225 millimeters of any opening. Any questions on those? Last couple of issues. Any thoughts on these two? The Part M specialist over there. Yes, exactly that. So the maximum allowable height. This was a new dwelling. Part M would be applicable. And maximum allowable height difference you allowed from a level threshold to the internal, the finished floor level would be 15 millimeters. The sill itself has a maximum pitch, I suppose is the right word, of 15 degrees as well, effectively to allow somebody to pop in. And there's an issue in relation to just some debris in the cavity trays, some preformed cavity trays. Good, so just how are we doing for time? I think we're okay, aren't we? Yeah. So just in relation to sum up really, for building control bodies in the future, and how I think that the industry generally is going to change or has changed following that issue and disaster in 2017. So there's been a number of reviews from a number of governing bodies. The first one was the Hackett Review, published in May 2018. And what that did is quite revolutionary in terms of its proposals. And there was a lot of criticism of building control bodies in general, and a lot of proposals in terms of how to go forward for high-risk buildings, what we term as HRRBs, high-rise residential buildings, so over 18 metres. Judith Hackett's proposal was for a joint competent authority. So, you know, before I was talking about building control bodies only having control at the point of construction and then issuing a final certificate, and then our role is effectively ended. The Fire Authority has an ongoing role under the RRO, and one of her proposals under the JCA was that local authorities, fire authorities and the HSE would have a combined role in terms of high-rise residential buildings. It hasn't been enacted, but that was one of her proposals. And she talked a lot about the construction industry as a whole and the race to the bottom, and again, like I said, some negative sort of opinions on the construction industry, where clearly post-Grenfell it was justified. It's a building regulations, building control, very topical issue. It was mentioned obviously in the Queen's speech a couple of months ago, and then the first phase of the inquiry into Grenfell was published in 30th of October, so not very long ago at all. And looking at that inquiry and its conclusions of it, there's a number of, it's free to download online, you can have a look through, and it does detail a number of the issues that were identified. In relation to Grenfell itself, it's a good indication, I suppose, of how the big building regulations have changed. So, for example, when it was initially designed in 1970, it was under the London Acts 1930 to 1939, so the local acts. Now then, when it was refurbed between 2012 and 2016, it was completed under the building regulations as amended 2010, so the current regulations. Now, within the inquiry, the phase 1 inquiry, which stresses focusing more on the fire authority's response, and they've received a lot of criticism within that inquiry report as well, rather than building control, which will come in phase 2 more. But what they have said, they've concluded that the works between 2012 and 2016 did not comply to the building regulations, which was quite a big surprise for a number of people who've been following that they came out with that statement at that point. And they've stipulated that purely on the basis of a number of, if you look at the details of the PIR installation and the ACM materials that were used to envelop the whole of the building, and the lack of compartmentation around that building and in between the windows and etc., which allowed the fire to spread from flat 16 to the void and the PIR installation, like I said, enveloping the building itself. So generally, it's made a number of recommendations within this phase 1 of the inquiry, looking mainly at the ability for the fire authority to have access to any information of that building, particularly in HRRBs, because the fire authority weren't aware of alterations that had taken place or similar. So they're talking about a digital record of alterations that have taken place, and that to be immediately available for any fire authority in the event of a fire occurring. For me, and obviously working within building control, that instance of the Grenfells reiterated to me the importance of the role that we have as building control surveyors, and I still think that we provide an important role in where issues need to be resolved. The proposals of the works that took place between 2012 and 2016, if we look back at where we said about material alterations, and under the material alterations, the enveloping of a building wouldn't necessarily constitute a material alteration. It's not a new dwelling, it's not a new public building, etc., etc., etc. But it falls foul of the building regulations in relation to making other parts of Schedule 1 significantly worse, particularly in relation to fire safety. So that would be under B3 and the need for compartmentation between dwellings. Just to sum up, clearly, like I said, the phase 1 of the review, the Hackett review itself, has led to a number of implications for building control bodies and approved inspectors. One of which, the updated guidance that we have, is the approved document B 2019, which was provided to us without any sort of transition period and has been in place since August. The key changes of that aren't particularly technical, apart from the need for insulated core panels and their compliance to Part B being transferred from the appendices of the approved documents into the main text. The key change of approved document B is the format itself. So originally it was a very obstructive, I think, and different reviews of different fire instances have said that it's impenetrable, if I can say the word properly. And now it's a lot clearer. So if you look at approved document L, for example, it's in the same format as approved document L, a lot easier to read, a lot easier to clarify different aspects. Going forward, like I said, I think that the whole instance of Grenfell and Simler and the subsequent reviews has reinforced my viewpoint of building control as an important function and a role to reduce the risk of life to those in the around building. Yes?
You mentioned earlier that details are independently assessed for fire.
Yes.
And I think they were on that. So if you get an independently assessed detail,
yes,
are you allowed to challenge it?
Yeah, so the issue with building control bodies, and to a certain extent, which was raised in part of the inquiry, is that you're completely right. Rather than details being independently improved, what is often independently improved is materials. And what I mean by that is within a certain framework, and particularly in this instance as an example, the materials that are installed in that location and within that method is completely unique and hasn't been replicated. So the ability to independently test and confirm that that material would be suitable to resist an hour of resistance in a compartment line if it was installed correctly, the certification isn't there because you can't replicate a 1970s design building with a concrete single staircase and then have replicate that instance of wrapping the whole building in PIR insulation. Yeah. But I appreciate what you're saying.
I think the element was assessed.
Exactly that, yeah. So, and that's where the issue has come in, particularly also in terms of fire doors and their testing, because there's issues which I'm sure will come out in the future in terms of fire doors and their testing with UCAS, etc., etc. So you can challenge that detail, and if that detail, I think it would be a case-by-case basis, for example. So I think if that detail...
I think the conclusion was it was non-combustible, but clearly that was wrong.
Well, exactly that, and I think the point would be that even if you've got a combustible... Where the assessment previously has been that if you have what we'd consider not a non-combustible material, with different Euro classifications, as long as you had sufficient compartmentation between the dwellings itself, then it would be sufficient in terms of the building regulations. That's my understanding. Now, clearly there's been a sea change in terms of the approach of that as well, and there's been a big focus from us as building control bodies to be more diligent, particularly in terms of high rise. Leading on to that, what I was going to say, clearly I'm sure many of you are aware that following, or more recently, there was an issue in terms of a few approved inspectors no longer operating and going bust, and that was particularly in relation to the PI insurance that were imparted on us. And literally 3 or 4 days ago, the government, talking about different contributing factors to the documents we need to be aware of, the government have produced an approach in terms of 2 tiers of building control. So those that deal with high rise and those that don't, having differing PI insurance, differing competency factors, which relates, I suppose, to a certain extent back to Dame Judith Hackett's initial sort of proposals. And the idea behind that is that clearly high rise is a specialism that needs further sort of justification before we approve different details. Yes.
Just splitting up the risk like that, do you see any prospect of approved surveyors, approved inspectors actually taking on the high risk work, or will it just go back to local authority?
The issue is and what happened following the increase in the PI values was, like I said, a number of some approved inspectors were no longer trading because they couldn't achieve, and one of the requirements of the building control performance standards is that you have a relevant PI insurance in place, and that's suitable for the works you undertake, etc., etc. Now, because some approved inspectors weren't able to get their PI insurance renewed, they then had to revert all of their works to the local authority. Now, if you think of that as I suppose in London, where this is a hypothetical situation, in London, an approved inspector that specialises just in high-rise buildings, and if they weren't able to renew their PI insurance, 400 projects within the centre of London which have been partially completed would then immediately have to revert to the local authority, which at that stage of the works being reverted wouldn't necessarily have the capacity, or again looking at skills and competency, perhaps not have those people in place that would be able to inspect those works. And also, if you take it from a risk point of view, if those works are set at, again, a hypothetical situation, a high-storey residential building, 25 stories, and half of it had already been completed with fire stopping or similar, and then would have to be reverted to a local authority which didn't have any of the subsequent information previously, then it was going to be, rather than reduce the risk, I think it increases the risk as a whole. Luckily, there's been a calming of certain from a PI insurance. OWL, as a building control body, we don't get involved with high-rise residential buildings. We're much more of domestic alterations and some commercial works as well. So we were relatively unaffected. But does that answer your question to us? I think the issue was the PI insurers obviously increased the extent, which led to a number of things in the industry which were unexpected, I suppose. And like I said, as an approved inspector, you can't revert to another approved inspector. It has to be reverted to the local authority. And if they don't have the capacity to deal with that, then it's causing additional issues for everyone involved. Any other questions at all? I think I've covered most of it.
Do you think there are any potential conflicts between central government requirements to improve insulation standards of buildings and EPC ratings and possible pressure placed on building controls for approved schemes? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point in terms of obviously the overarching. So originally the Building Act itself was purely on the basis of protecting life and welfare in and around buildings, and then they added lots of, if you looked at regulations 2010, there's lots of addendums in terms of Part L and requirements, and now split into 4 different functions. And I suppose that one of the issues that yourselves would find as surveyors would be the need for retrofitting of insulation, the potential impacts of condensation risk or similar that would occur. Clearly, from a local authority point of view, and their need to upgrade their existing housing stock can cause additional issues. But I think if you apply the regulations correctly, then those issues should be mitigated. But it does cause additional problems, I suppose, is the word. Yeah, exactly. I mean, as an approved inspector, we're in a unique position that we can revert work or refuse work or similar, and I suppose we're slightly detached from that local government pressure, I suppose, is the word. Perfect. Yes?
Do approved inspectors have any scope to go outside of the regulations?
So that it's only the... what do you mean? Sorry, just...
Well, I get a lot of instances where I do an inspection on a property and find that things don't comply.
Right.
And then talking with the homeowner, they've had an approved inspector who signed it all off as being okay. Headroom over stairs is the prime one.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly I don't know the case, so I'm not going to... All I'd say generally, the thing to remember, I suppose, to a certain extent, is that the building regulations are the small little line that's at the top, detailing, so in terms of B1, sufficient means of escape, B4, sufficient separation from neighbouring properties. The approved documents themselves, like I said, are guidance. Now, in terms of relaxation, the only body that can relax it is the local authority, like I said, and the thing to remember, I suppose, would be the functional requirements of the building regulations. So in some instances, headroom can be reduced for a loft conversion, for example, in ADK down to 1.8 if it's sloping as well. But a general relaxation, no, an approved inspector is unable to do so. It's only the local authority. You get that a lot of instances with Part M, for example, if you've got a severely sloping site, an approved inspector really should or is required to maintain the need for disabled access. If there was dispensation, then it should come only from the local authority. Yes?
This is rather different from what we've been covering mostly, but I'm a surveyor just looking at pre-purchase surveys.
Yes.
And my main interest in building control is to look for evidence of sign-off of alterations.
Yes.
I'm finding more and more that if it's been a local authority building control, there's a record of it.
Yeah.
But approved inspector sign-offs, I can't find any evidence of. Is there any prospect of approved inspector approvals being put on the local council registers?
The issue is obviously as a separate organisation, those wouldn't be directly uploaded, and it would create a huge amount of workload for the local authority, I suspect, to then have to upload all of those to a central body or similar. All I would say is just be aware that the certificates that we're able to issue as approved inspectors differ from a local authority, like I said. So we can't do plans approval, for example, but we can accept those in accordance. They appear to be in accordance in the plans. And our final certificates, again, slightly different, going back to the building regulations and the approved inspector regulations.
So you can't do plans approval?
Yeah, so, sorry, it's slightly different. So if you were to submit full plan submission to a local, sorry, do apologise. Can I answer your query first? Yeah, so I think, so generally the reason the local authorities don't upload it all because it would be the workload, I think, for all of the final certificates that the AI produce. I profess I don't know whether there's a central area that they all are located, all of our final certificates and local authorities ones. I suspect that might be down the role of a solicitor or similar. Yes, I profess I don't know. So I can find that out if required. Sorry, I know I've kind of partially answered your question, sorry. Yeah, in terms of full plans approval. So if you submit plans to the local authority, like I said, you've got two methods, building notice and full plans approval. The local authority would assess the plans in accordance with the building regulations and then issue a full plans approval, preferably prior to works commencing on site. Now, we work in a very similar way. We have plans and we do a design review or a plan check or similar. But if you look at the actual documentation an AI would issue, it would be acceptance of the plans that have been issued rather than approval. We're unable to approve plans. We can say that they appear to fulfil the functional requirements of the building regulations, but we can't issue
What does that mean in practical terms?
In practical terms, there's no difference for yourselves as architects or agents or builders or owners on site. But I was just clarifying that the differences between the certificates that the local authority can issue and an approved inspector do differ.
Does that also follow on for a completion certificate then?
Yes, so again, we issue a final certificate, but they do differ slightly from the final certificates that are issued. They fulfil all the requirements in terms of solicitors asking for confirmation at the end of the works that the works are complied or similar, but they do differ slightly in terms of the wording.
Why is there a difference?
Again, going back to those regulations that we work under. So the Building Regulations 2010 are the governing piece of legislation that local authorities work under. We have an additional piece of legislation, which is the Approved Inspectors Regulations 2010. The whole reason behind it is when it was originally set up was that approved inspectors would be a subsidiary is the wrong word, but an additional function to the local authorities governing, I suppose. And so, for example, to give you an indication, if you come to an approved inspector for works to be commenced and you say, we want you to work on this, to look after this project in terms of building control, we would submit what's known as an initial notice to the local authority, 5 days prior to the works commencing. And we need that 5-day rule. And it's the local authority who then have to accept our initial notice. If they don't respond, then we assume that they have accepted, which is the accepted method. But it gives you an indication that we need to tell them that we are acting.
So are you saying it's the legislation that prevents you issuing a full plans approval?
Yeah, exactly that. Yes.
It's legislation.
It's the.
That can change, I suppose.
Potentially, yeah.
If you wanted it.
Well, the government would obviously have to change the primary legislation.
Yeah, if you wanted it, presumably you'd lobby them, wouldn't you? So.
Yeah, I think at the moment the idea is that the impact on agents, surveyors, homeowners, the reality is that there appears to be very little difference between the two.
So it's not a risk mitigation issue?
No, not at all.
I'd be interested to know if anybody in the room has had a similar experience to me. I tend to default to local authority because as more and more approved inspectors have come in, I've found that they seem to be very, very matey with the builders. I mean that in a negative way. And there's never any paperwork anywhere. I submit, a builder will persuade a householder, and off they go. And I submit stuff into a vacuum, and I never hear back from anybody. And it sort of tallies what this chap said if he's looking at something afterwards. There's no paper trail anywhere.
I think that the issue is...
I've worked with Howland, that's not...
No, of course. No, I appreciate...
There are ones out there. I wonder if anybody else has had the same.
Do you mind if I just comment? Is that okay? You know, I think, what I would say is that from my point of view, having worked in both local authority and approved inspectors, clearly you get differing personnel in both organisations. And it's a conversation I had with Brian, the MD, yesterday. We met up and we had a look at a site. We were talking about CIC requirements. I won't bore you with the details. But we were and I said, well, purely on the basis, clearly you get some good surveyors and clearly you get some bad surveyors. And I think that they can be in both approved inspectors and in local authorities. And I think in the same way as you get good surveyors who own their own business, and you get good, one-man bands, and then you get good surveyors who are part of a national organisation, but you also get some bad in both. So I think that's probably the only way that I can detail it. Clearly people have had negative experiences of both local authorities and approved inspectors.
On the one hand, if I submit some plans and I never hear back, on the one hand, I think, well, that's great, I haven't got to update my plans. But on the other hand, I think, it's not a very good service.
No, exactly. And when you're thinking from going back to, okay, from a domestic project, or I don't know what you're dealing with, but a domestic project or similar, the risk is never going to be Grenfell-esque, is it? But from going back to the overarching requirements of the building regulations and making people safe and the welfare, that's an important role, and I think it's something that should be taken in due course. And particularly, obviously, as yourself as an agent or surveyor submitting plans, you want to make sure that they comply.
Well, yeah, and the other aspect is, without sounding too cocky, I already know they're all right.
Yeah.
But I want my client to know
of course.
From a third party.
And that goes back to the building control performance standards, which is something we're really keen at Al, where it talks about reducing the instance of holding up works on site. Basically, I've sort of paraphrased there, and that's within the building control performance standards themselves, meaning that we need to communicate as approved inspectors with agents, with builders, etc., etc. And that's just, you could say that's just part of being a professional in their role, but also it's part of the guidelines that we need to work under as well. Yes.
Don't you think there's a problem, as these other guys have said, that we as surveyors raise issues that we never get responses to in terms of building regulations, and solicitors just seem to produce indemnity policies that seem to satisfy, everybody to push things through.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually do anything for anybody, but it does give prospective purchasers and solicitors comfort to proceed with the purchase.
Yeah.
It doesn't rectify anything.
No, again, I would, not being an expert in terms of solicitors and the indemnity policies that they produce, having conversations with people in local authority about those indemnity policies, that, in my opinion, I don't think that they are the panacea, I suppose is the word, that they are portrayed to be. And I'd highly recommend people going down a regularisation route with a local authority rather than going down the indemnity policy. But I understand that also when people, clearly, having bought your own house or whatever, when I'm buying a house, that you want it to proceed as smoothly as possible. I suppose that's the whole idea of getting surveyors involved as soon as possible and identifying those issues.
Well, no one wants to get involved with destructive investigation, do they?
Of course. And and going back to regularisation, like I said, having completed some of those myself, using a simple example, if we've got a steel beam that's been installed, 8 years ago for a chimney breast removal. Now, often, if a local authority, the problem is, again, talking back to different surveyors in different roles, but a local authority inspector should be able to look at that and say, well, if there's no cracking there that indicates structural failure, it's functioned for 8 years or more, we've got the calculations originally produced by the engineer to specify the beam that's been installed, or plate, or whatever, and we've got photographic evidence, then there shouldn't be any need for destructive works or similar.
Well, that's quite rare.
Yeah, it is very
right. We're being a bit idealistic there.
But I think the problem is that in terms of established use, once the project's being done, 2, 3, 4 years later, everything's covered up, and it's got established use, and that's the problem in terms of building regulation and the lack of building regs actually taking action against people doing
regulated works. Yeah. Well, I'll just touch briefly on talking about enforcement. We talked about this before last week, and like I said, I've only spent a short time period in local authority, and I profess that my colleagues in OWL have spent a lot longer than I have and a lot more knowledge of enforcement actions and those similar. So the enforcement actions, although only the local authority can complete it, the actual incidents, the number that they enforce is relatively low. The issue, I suppose, is that under Section 36 and Section 35, it would actually be the homeowner that would be taken to court rather than the builder itself, because it's the homeowner who needs to build in accordance with the building regulations. So in some instances where perhaps a cowboy builder has completed an extension, then if the local authority were to enforce those sections, they would be going after the homeowner, which clearly in some instances is not what the homeowner would want, clearly. And that's why I think sometimes that training standards are involved to a certain extent with regulated works instead.
Would that be the current homeowner or the homeowner who'd had the work done?
Interesting point. So clearly, if there's been the issue you would have then, I suppose, would be conflicting legislation in terms of the indemnity policy that we talked about before. If the house purchase has gone through. Not being an expert, again, in legal matters of building control, etc., I suspect it would be the homeowner that completed the original works, but I'd have to double check that.
Indemnity insurance protects against being sued.
Exactly.
It doesn't
protect against the issue.
Made to take the structure down.
Exactly.
Which is why when I talk to clients, I often say to them, it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Yes. I know that obviously you've got the historic presentation later on, and he was talking about indemnity policies for something similar, and I think his opinion was...
Well, I think the problem with the legal profession, and this is personal opinion, is that they've turned themselves into process people rather than investigative
yes.
at all. I actually dealt with the conveyancer who was buying a house as a client, and I was absolutely gobsmacked by their lack of knowledge.
I think that's the key point to detail to your clients when they're recommended these indemnity policies. Yes, because it protects them against getting sued. It doesn't protect the beam from failing. It doesn't protect the risk to means of escape. It doesn't protect the condensation issues that could occur on all the raft of building regulations that we've talked about.
There is a problem, I think, in the broader sense with the building regs, which is the majority of homeowners don't appreciate what building regs are.
Yeah, and I think the problem...
And the communication of that to the public isn't good.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. Often clearly, most of the conversations I have directly with clients is, well, we've got planning approval, that's all we need, and clearly, and that's a bit of an issue, isn't it, from the offset? And I think, explaining the reasons why you need to have building regulations, because often sometimes the client and the homeowner can see us as a bit of a pain, particularly if they want a winding, glorious staircase, grand designs or similar, and we're saying it doesn't apply to parquet, put a handrail in there. We don't go down as the most, in terms of, but clearly that's we're looking at protecting the well-being of those in and around buildings, which is our function.
I thought enforcement was something that could only be done for a relatively short period of time after the work.
You're correct, yeah. So the problem, going back to again, the issue is under Section 5, Section 35. If you read the legislation, it talks about 1 year after the work's been completed. The issue you've got with that, for example, chat to Brian, previously the MD worked a number of years in local authority. He said, well, you go out and you have a look at a foundation, it looks fine, and it's consistent strata, and then you go back a couple of weeks and look at the DPC. What you don't know in between is rather than pouring the foundation where they dug, they've backfilled it and they've only got 2 inches of concrete, for example. And then clearly it's not going to fail within the first year of that initial pour, or it goes on hold or whatever, and then you come back in a year and a half and it's failed. Actually, if you look at the legislation, it's when the local authority is made aware of the contravention itself, and that's when enforcement takes place. That's the timescale that you can work to. So in which case, when the building started to fail, that would be when the clock would start ticking, a year from that point.
So if as a surveyor, I tip off council that there's been a dodgy job done here, that starts a year's
They should, well, what they would do,
Dropping my client, you know,
no, what they should do is they would raise a job known as unauthorised works. Unauthorised works, which means that the building control surveyor would attend, ascertain what works have been done and inform them of the need for a new application to go in place. But the building control, yeah, if you inform the local authority, they should be sending somebody out to have a look. But again, going back to, you know, capacity and all those other things, is if you're looking at if an AI is reverting, sorry, I'll go. If an AI is reverting lots and lots of jobs, then the local authority's ability, their capacity to complete those other functions, which are very, very important, dangerous structures, sports grounds, etc., is significantly reduced. Good. I think I've covered everything. JJ's waving at me, so I better go. Thank you.